Hello. Tonight's reading is a continuation of Rainbow's End. It is my hope or my plan to complete the reading of this book. However, as mentioned in my last video, if you do have a request of a particular book you would like me to read to you to set you off to sleep, I am more than happy to do so. Just drop a comment in the comment box and I will go searching for that book and read it to you. Until then, again, I'm going to complete this reading. As always, I do hope that you sleep well. I hope my reading helps and that tonight's sleep is restful and peaceful. Okay, let us begin. He was there a minute ago. I have a feeling he's been watching the house for some time. Frowning, she deposited Keith's plate on the table and refilled his mug from the pot she carried in her other hand, keeping one eye on the distant boulders. When I saw him yesterday, he didn't look very well cared for. He might even be hungry. If I could figure out a way to coax him closer, I'm sure I could find out. I used to be pretty good with kids. Her concern for the little boy had overridden her self-consciousness and reticence, and Keith marveled at the change in her. For a brief moment he had an intriguing glimpse of the engaged, self-assured woman she must once have been. But that window into her past closed the instant she realized he was watching her. Turning abruptly, she started back to the house. "Aren't you having any?" His question stopped her, and she half turned. "I don't eat much breakfast." He wasn't surprised. Now that she'd ditched the bulky jacket, there was no question about her gender. Her lithe figure was rounded in all the right places. A soft chambray shirt hinted at the curves beneath, and her unpretentious jeans encased her long legs like a second skin. It had been a long while since Keith had noticed a woman's physical attributes, and years since he's taken such a detailed inventory. He had no idea what had possessed him to do so now, and he wasn't inclined to analyze it. Better to move on to another, safer topic. "If you won't join me, at least let me introduce myself." He rose and extended his hand. "My name is Keith Michaels." He wasn't sure she would respond, but after a brief hesitation, she dipped her head, stepped towards him, and took his fingers in a grip that displayed surprising strength. "Jill Whalen." As the stranger held Jill's hand, he also held her captive with his compelling blue eyes. They seemed to delve into her heart, searching, seeing things she had never given voice to. Of course, such fanciful thoughts were no more than the product of an overactive imagination. She chided herself, but it was an odd sensation nonetheless. The sudden ringing of the phone broke the spell, and with a slight tug, she reclaimed her hand and turned toward the house. "You'd better eat those while they're still warm. Some things taste just as good cold, but pancakes aren't one of them." Hurrying toward the phone, Jill left the back door ajar instead of closing and locking it, as she had up until now. There was something in the man's face, character and integrity, certainly, but also a distant sadness, as if he, too, had suffered some terrible tragedy that told her she had nothing to fear from him. Nothing physical, anyway. Her emotions were another story. He'd disrupted those already, but she had a feeling no wooden door would protect her from that kind of danger, anyway. When she answered the phone, she was a bit out of breath, which didn't escape her sister's notice. Is everything okay? Did I catch you at a bad time? Deb queried. No, no, I'm fine. I was outside. At this hour? You're always eating your yogurt and reading the paper now. Goodness, was she that predictable? But the resounding answer was yes. Deb called like clockwork at 9:30 every Saturday morning, and like clockwork, Jill would be reading the local weekly newspaper, which she saved for that occasion in order to differentiate the weekend from the work week. Except today she had forgotten all about the paper and her yogurt and even Deb's call, thanks to one Keith Michaels, now ensconced on her back porch eating her blackberry pancakes. We had a storm last night and a piece of siding got ripped off the side of the house, Jill explained, redirecting her attention to the conversation. I hope you weren't climbing on ladders. There's not much choice when the problem is on the second floor. But you hate ladders. Look, I know you're handy, but can't you get someone to fix it for you? It's already done, Deb. That figures. Her sister gave a long, suffering sigh. You know, I ought to send my husband out there to take a few lessons from you. Tony's a wonderful provider, but when it comes to home maintenance, he's as useless as a cell phone with a dead battery. You must have been at it at the crack of dawn. Before she could respond, the back screen door opened and Keith came in far enough to deposit his plate and juice glass on the container. Then he retreated to the porch, the screen door banging it behind him. Jill? What was that? Typical Deb. She didn't miss a thing, Jill thought with a wry shake of her head. The back door. Who came in? Is everything okay? Everything's fine. Look, it's kind of a long story. I've got all day. It's no big deal, Deb. Then why don't you trust me to tell me? Shaking her head, Jill let out a resigned sigh. Did anyone ever tell you you were pushy? Yeah, you do, all the time. But hey, that's what sisters are for. Now spill it. If you have a visitor, I want to hear all about it. This doesn't happen every day. Knowing Deb wouldn't let up until she got the information she wanted, Jill gave her a shorthand version. I let a guy use the cottage last night. They sent him out from town because there isn't a room to be had over the holiday weekend. and it was raining cats and dogs. Turns out he's a carpenter, and he offered to put the siding back up for me. I gave him breakfast on the porch as a thank you. He just brought in his empty plate. Silence greeted her narration. When it lengthened, Jill spoke again. Deb, are you still there? Yeah, I'm here. You took in a boarder, and you're letting him wander around your house? He's not a boarder. He stayed for one night. And he's not wandering around my house. Who's this guy? I have no idea. What does he look like? What difference does that make? Just answer the question. I don't know. She turned to look out the door. Keith was standing by the porch railing, sipping his coffee, his strong profile thrown into sharp relief by the morning sun. Angling away from the door, she lowered her voice. He's a little shaggy around the edges and a bit road weary, but he looks honest. How old is he? What is this, the third degree? Look, when some guy shows up on my sister's doorstep, my sister, who avoids people like the plague, especially men, and she lets him wander around her house, I have reason to be concerned. So, how old is he? Letting her sister's remark about avoiding people pass, Jill answered the question. 40-ish, maybe. Another few beats of silence passed. I'm not sure I like this, Jill. I love your place, but it's very isolated. I worry about you alone out there. I'm fine, Deb. There's no need for concern. I was just being a good Samaritan. He's been very polite and grateful, and he's leaving in a few minutes. End of story. She didn't sound convinced. Call me after he's gone, okay? Deb, just call me, okay? Otherwise, I'll worry about you more than I already do. Fine, I'll call. Now let's talk about more important things, like your visit in 2 weeks. I can't wait to see you and Dominic. We're looking forward to it too. Dominic can't talk about anything else. It's Auntie Jill this and Auntie Jill that. And can we collect rocks at the beach again and go watch whales and climb that mountain? Yada, yada, yada. Tell him the answer to all of those questions is yes. Now let's talk logistics. As they worked out the details, Jill realized that she was as excited about the annual visit as her sister and nephew were. Much as she loved her life on her little corner of Orcas Island, it did get lonely on occasion, more so at some times than others. Turning toward the porch again, her gaze once more sought Keith. He was standing with his back to her now as he looked toward Mount Constitution. In a few minutes he would be gone, as she had told Deb. And even though she knew nothing about him, even though his visit had been brief, she had the oddest feeling that his departure would initiate one of those more so times. Only snatches of conversation drifted through the open screen door to Keith, but he heard enough to realize that Jill was discussing plans with a woman named Deb for a visit, and that pleased him. It meant there was someone who cared about her and gave her an occasional reprieve from her solitary existence. He drew in a long, cleansing breath of the fresh morning air, enjoying the warmth of the sun against his face. To his surprise, the sense of peace he had awakened with was still with him. He'd expected it to dissipate, along with the wisps of mist that had hung over the field earlier in the morning as he had trekked across. The feeling was so welcome, so calming, that he was loath to drive away and risk leaving it behind. But he had no excuse to stay. The woman in East Sound had told him that Jill didn't lease her cottage. Besides, he didn't have enough money to pay rent for long, anyway. Yet, he wanted to stay for a few days at least. Long enough, perhaps, for the peace to soothe his soul and give him a chance to figure out where he was going to go from here. His finances could handle a short extension of this visit. The trick would be convincing his reluctant landlady to prolong her hospitality. When Jill reappeared, Keith's mug was almost empty. "Sorry for the interruption. Would you like some more coffee?" she offered, keeping her distance. "No, thanks. The breakfast was great. I haven't had a meal like that in ages." She acknowledged the compliment with a slight tip of her head. "Thank you for fixing the siding. It was the least I could do after you took pity on me in the storm. I don't know what I would have done otherwise." "The holiday weekend is always crowded here. I doubt there's a vacancy anywhere on the island." She had given him the perfect opening. His grip on the mug tightened, and the muscles in his shoulders tensed, even as he tried to keep his tone casual. "I found that out the hard way. The truth is, I'd hoped to spend a few days here, but every place will be booked at least for a couple more days. The woman in East Sound told me you don't rent out the cottage as a rule, but is there any way I could convince you to let me stay here a bit longer? Not free, of course." His request surprised her, and at some elemental level it also pleased her. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps because her less than welcoming manner and damaged face hadn't scared him off. Of course, she was silly to read anything personal into his request. It was based on practicalness and practicalities, after all. She had a cabin. He needed a place to stay. Everywhere else was booked. It was as simple and straightforward as that. Her spirits deflated a bit. She must be more starved for human companionship than she had realized. If that was the case, she needed to figure out how to deal with it, because she didn't anticipate any change to her solitary existence anytime soon. Even if this man extended his stay, he'd be gone in a few days. But Deb and Dominic would follow in a couple of weeks, she reminded herself. She should be counting her blessings for having such a loving, supportive family instead of gripping about the life she'd chosen for herself. In the meantime, this man needed a place to stay, and she was in a position to provide it. There was no logical reason to refuse his request. You can use a cottage for a few days. It's sitting there empty anyway. She started to gather up the condiments from the table. Just let me know what you think is a fair price. There's no charge. You're not getting any great bargain out here. It's pretty bare bones. It's far better than camping, which is what I do most of the time. I wouldn't feel right about staying if you don't let me pay. Straightening, she sent him a sideways look. I don't need the money, Mr. Michaels. Keith, and that's beside the point. I prefer to pay my way. From the stubborn set of jaw beneath the stubble and the resolve in his eyes, Jill could see that her unexpected guest wasn't about to budge on his issue. Shrugging, she resumed her work. Fine. Let me think for a minute. Silence ensued as she gathered up the tablecloth, and when she finally threw out a number, Keith frowned. You can't even get a cheap motel for that rate, he protested. The barest hint of a smile played at the corners of her mouth. I think there's something wrong with this picture. Isn't the buyer supposed to try and negotiate a lower price, not a higher one? An answering grin tugged at his mouth. This time his lips corporated, twitching up a fraction. I want to be fair. I consider the price I quoted more than fair, since I offered the cabin to you free. Her point was hard to dispute. With a gesture of capitulation, he gave in. Then I accept, with thanks. He took the last swig of his coffee and handed her the mug. When his firm, strong fingers brushed hers, she tried not to notice. I think I'll head out and do a little exploring. Stock up on some provisions. Thanks again, Jill. He turned and struck out across a field. As Jill watched him recede into the distance, focusing on his broad back, she tried to figure out why she'd agreed to rent her cabin to the stranger. Considering how she guarded her privacy, it was an odd thing to do. She should be sending him on his way, not inviting him to share her space. It made no sense. And if she couldn't explain her behavior to herself, how in the world was she going to explain it to Deb? The place was a pigsty. Hot color crept up Jill's neck to her cheeks as she surveyed the cluttered, dirty cabin where Keith had spent last night. The dust was deep enough to ride in. Bits of debris clung to the woven rugs, and the thick grime on the windows was as effective as shades in diffusing the sunlight. On top of all that, the whole place smelled musty, Half of the light bulbs were burned out, and cobwebs had staked a claim on the corners of the ceiling. Yet her unexpected visitor not only wanted to pay to stay here, he considered it a bargain. Well, Jill knew better. The place was more suited to its current role as a storage shed than to a human habitation. Of course, at one time it had been much more livable. Jill had spent the last 6 months of her stay here while she rehabbed the decrepit main house. But since moving out, she had done little to maintain the interior. Now that she had a paying guest, however, she needed to make up for lost time. Unsure how long Keith would be gone, Jill went into high gear. She dusted, vacuumed, mopped, scoured the kitchen and bathroom, stripped the bed and remade it with clean sheets, and washed all the windows. Then she gathered up the baskets on the counter, carried the boxes of kitchen odds and ends outside, and collected her hard supplies, wedging them into her car for a trip across the field to the house. As a final touch, she put a vase of fresh wildflowers in the center of the small oak dining table, propping a note beside it that directed Keith to the refrigerator. Finished, she stepped back to assess the results of her 2 hours of intensive labor. The windows sparkled. The polished surface of the table glistened. Every bit of dust and debris had been vanquished. The bathroom and kitchen were spick and span, and the light fixtures gleamed. With a satisfied nod, she packed up her supplies and headed home. As she crossed the field, she couldn't help but wonder what her temporary tenant would think about the transformation in his accommodations. She hoped he'd be pleased. After all, if he was willing to pay for the privilege of occupying her modest cabin, the least she could do was give it a thorough cleaning. Of course, if he was like a lot of men, he wouldn't notice the care she had taken to make him feel welcome. But already Jill was getting the distinct feeling that Keith Michaels wasn't like a lot of men, not even close. For a fleeting second, Keith wasn't unsure he was in the right cabin. As he stepped across the threshold, arms laden with grocery bags and laundry, he came to an abrupt stop. The cabin was immaculate. Every vestige of grime and neglect had been removed. The place was so clean, it almost glowed. Stunned, Keith did a slow inventory. Crisp curtains hung at the spotless windows. When he dropped the laundry onto the couch, no dust cloud engulfed him. A peek into the bedroom revealed a neatly made bed, with decorative pillows fluffed against the headboard. The bathroom floor looked clean enough to eat off, and the kitchen was pristine. Completing his circuit in the dining above, he spotted the flowers and note. Reaching for the single sheet of paper, he scanned the simple message, which was written in a flowing, graceful script. Sorry for the mess you found when you arrived. Hope the homemade soup in the fridge helps make up for it. Somehow, the fact that Jill had scoured the place didn't surprise him, but the soup was an added and touching bonus. With an eagerness he couldn't have suppressed if he tried, he returned to the kitchen and opened the fridge. Sure enough, a large container stood in the otherwise empty interior. Lifting the lid, he inhaled ambrosia. Memories of better times, of home and comfort and love, washed over him in a cleansing wave. And for a second it was like a taste of heaven. Though the impression was fleeting, it was a balm to Keith's ravaged soul. That brief glimpse of happiness, of joy and contentment and rightness, was the first such moment he'd had since his world began to fall apart. And if he could have one such moment, perhaps others would follow, he realized, his spirits notching up another peg. Odd, just when his hope was running on fumes, it had been given a boost by his reluctant landlady, a woman who had suffered her own trauma, who had lost a man Keith assumed she loved, who had suffered a terrible injury, and who now lived alone with her memories, secluded in this beautiful but remote place. A woman who had chosen a solitary life, but had nevertheless reached out to him in his need. Her unselfish kindness touched him in a way nothing else had for 2 years. Okay. I think I will end this reading for tonight. I do hope that you are sleeping right now. Considering whether I should do, 30 minutes readings or an hour and more. Certainly, I probably should state this in the beginning of my recordings. Okay. Um, in any event, I hope you are sleeping restfully. And until I talk to you again or read to you again, good night.